The argument that women and women's groups involved in civil society and peace building is not an essentialist argument, right? It's not an argument that men and women are fundamentally different. But rather we find that consistently women tend to bring to the table, women's activist groups tend to bring to the table a broader set of concerns and demands for political transformation than is typically found in cases where you have elite negotiations among male leaders. So the issues can be, for instance, addressing questions of material inequality. It can be addressing questions of how political violence becomes routinized or everyday quotidian violence. That is, violence that's not formally political, but occurs nevertheless against substantial numbers of the population in the private sphere. We know that violence, for instance, in the private domain, in the private sphere, often precedes high levels of political violence. And women's groups are very often capable of articulating these connections because they experience it and they organize themselves around addressing these questions. And they're also just in general more concerned about addressing issues of access to basic basic development rights and development concerns.
How do you define it, and what is actually reconciliation in practice?
That's a very difficult question. But briefly, one way to understand the emergence of the term reconciliation in these debates is by looking back to the 1990s. So the language of reconciliation emerged in the context of transitions from violence when prosecutions were not possible due to amnesties. So there emerged this whole discourse in international human rights about promoting political reconciliation rather than so-called justice, that is, rather than prosecutions and accountability. We're beyond that distinction now, and we now realize that reconciliation is much more inclusive and shouldn't be set against justice. But that's where its origins lie. When I think of reconciliation today, I think very generically, very broadly of a state of affairs or a state of practices that is inclusive and respectful of political differences. So a condition of reconciliation is one where the old divisions that drove the violence in the past are no longer the primary divisions or the primary drivers. So that's a condition of reconciliation. But that can include everything from minimal reconciliation, something like having formal voting rights, rule of law, etc., all the way to something much more substantial, which is a real transformation in social relations. Some theological arguments advocate for the importance of forgiveness, for instance. I wouldn't go that far. I think that those models of political reconciliation place too high a burden on what we can expect in fragile societies. But political reconciliation broadly means a condition where different groups can coexist in some morally acceptable way. Well, there are a variety of different processes, procedures, strategies that are available. I think one way to think about it is to actually divide it analytically into different levels. So you can think of reconciliation strategies at the political elite level, kind of thing political leaders do between one another. It might include accepting power sharing, recognizing the outcome of certain votes, reforming the rule of law, addressing cultures of impunity. There's also the question of addressing it at the institutional level. That means reforming governance structures, reforming security apparatus, the use of trials sometimes, but even truth and reconciliation commissions can be used selectively. A third analytical level concerns civil society. And civil society groups, as I was talking about a little bit earlier, can often push for a much deeper reckoning of historical wrongs. So they can question and challenge very convenient elite narratives of what reconciliation means. And civil society can also promote historical memory and kind of dealing with the past and in more substantive ways. And then lastly, there's an interpersonal dimension. And that's just basically how people coexist with one another. That, I think, is the hardest one to promote. And I don't think it can be done in a top-down fashion. That's reconciliation from the bottom up.